With just $4,200 in a secret savings account and 8 months of careful planning, Sandra Williams was counting down the days until she could disappear forever. But at 24, working the graveyard shift at Murphy's Diner on the outskirts of Portland, she had learned that escape required more than money. It required invisibility. And tonight, that invisibility was about to shatter. Sandra balanced the worn ceramic plates with the practiced grace of someone who had been serving coffee and pie to truckers and insomniacs for 3 years. She was methodical, focused, and desperate. Her goal was simple: save $8,000, change her name, and vanish to a city where Marcus Garrett would never find her. The concealer under her left eye was holding, but she could feel the tender bruise beneath it, a reminder of their last encounter 2 weeks ago. She had managed to avoid him since then, changing her shifts, staying with friends, moving like a ghost through her own life. Her natural hair was pulled back in a tight bun, professional and practical. Those soft curls escaped to frame her face. She was tall, nearly 5'8", with steady hands and warm brown eyes that had learned to avoid direct contact. Nursing school was her dream, had always been her dream, but Marcus had made it clear that dreams were luxuries she couldn't afford. Every shift at Murphy's was a step toward reclaiming that future. The diner at 2 in the morning was usually quiet, filled with the steady hum of the industrial coffee maker and the occasional clink of silverware against ceramic. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting everything in harsh white light that made the red vinyl booths look faded and tired. Sandra preferred these hours. Fewer customers meant fewer chances for Marcus to find her, fewer people to witness the fear that she carried like a weight in her chest. Table 7 held a single customer, a Korean man in an expensive black suit that seemed too formal for a place like Murphy's. Late 30s, she estimated, with an air of controlled intensity that made the other late-night regulars give him a wide berth. His presence had been a constant for the past month, always the same booth, always the same order, black coffee and whatever pie was fresh. He never caused trouble, never made conversation beyond the necessary pleasantries, but Sandra had noticed the way he watched everything, the way his dark eyes missed nothing. Kong Taemin was a study in controlled intensity. His suit was impeccably tailored, the kind of garment that cost more than Sandra made in 3 months, and his shoes were Italian leather, polished to a mirror shine. Everything about him suggested wealth and power, but it was the stillness that marked him as dangerous. He moved with the economy of someone who never wasted motion, never showed more emotion than he intended. His sharp features were almost sculpted, high cheekbones and a strong jaw, with black hair swept back from his forehead. When he looked at someone, it was with the focus of a predator evaluating prey. Sandra approached his table with her usual professional smile, notepad ready. "What can I get you tonight?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "Coffee, black," Kong Taemin replied, his English perfect but colored with the faintest accent. His voice was low, controlled, the kind of voice that didn't need to be raised to command attention. "And a slice of the apple pie." Sandra nodded, scribbling the familiar order. She had learned not to make small talk with this customer. There was something about him that suggested conversation was a privilege, not a right, and she had enough complications in her life without adding mysterious strangers to the list. As she turned to walk away, Taemin's voice stopped her. "You've been working here long?" he asked, the question casual but his tone suggesting it was anything but. 3 years, Sandra replied, not turning around. She could feel his gaze on her back, analytical and thorough. "You seem tired," he observed. "I work nights," she said simply, finally facing him. "It comes with the territory." Taemin nodded slowly, his dark eyes studying her face with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. He had noticed things about her over the past month, details that most people missed. The way she favored her left side when she walked, suggesting old injuries. The careful way she applied makeup around her eyes. The fact that she always positioned herself near exits, always kept her back to walls when possible. These were the habits of someone who had learned to be afraid. "I'll have that coffee when you get a chance," he said finally, dismissing her with a slight nod. Sandra retreated to the coffee station, her hands steady despite the unease crawling up her spine. There was something about the way he looked at her that suggested he saw more than she wanted to reveal. In her experience, men who paid too much attention were men to avoid. But this customer was different. His attention felt less predatory than protective, though she couldn't explain why. She was pouring his coffee when the bell above the door chimed, and every muscle in her body went rigid. The ceramic mug slipped from her fingers, shattering against the floor in a spray of hot liquid and white fragments. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she recognized the familiar swagger, the practiced charm that had once fooled her into believing he cared. Marcus Garrett stood in the doorway like he owned the place, his blonde hair perfectly styled, his smile sharp as a blade. He was handsome in the way that made people overlook the cruelty in his blue eyes, the way his hands had a tendency to curl into fists when he didn't get his way. He wore expensive clothes and drove an expensive car, all of it paid for with money that Sandra had never asked about because she was afraid of the answers. Well, Marcus said, his voice carrying across the empty diner. Look what I found. Sandra's blood turned to ice. She had been so careful, so methodical in avoiding him. She had changed her schedule 3 times, moved apartments twice, cut contact with mutual friends. But somehow, he had found her anyway. Sandra, he continued, walking toward her with the confident stride of someone who had never been told no. We need to talk. I'm working, Sandra managed, her voice steady despite the terror clawing at her throat. She bent to clean up the broken mug, her hands shaking as she gathered the ceramic pieces. Not anymore, Marcus said, grabbing her wrist and pulling her upright. The grip was firm enough to bruise, and Sandra couldn't suppress the small gasp of pain that escaped her lips. From his booth, Kong Taemin observed the interaction with the cold focus of a predator identifying a threat. He had noticed Sandra's fear response the moment the blonde man entered, had seen the way her body language shifted from professional composure to barely contained terror. The broken mug, the trembling hands, the way she instinctively tried to make herself smaller. These were the signs he had learned to recognize, the patterns that reminded him of another young woman who had needed help that never came. Marcus's grip on Sandra's wrist revealed purple fingerprints, old bruises in the shape of hands that had held too tight and hurt too much. Taemin's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, his dark eyes cataloging every detail of the interaction. You can't keep running from me, Sandra, Marcus continued, his voice low but carrying the unmistakable edge of a threat. We had an agreement. You belong to me. I don't belong to anyone, Sandra replied, trying to pull her wrist free. The words were braver than she felt, but 3 years of hiding had taught her that showing fear only encouraged men like Marcus. Marcus laughed, the sound sharp and humorless. That's where you're wrong, sweetheart. You took my money, lived in my apartment, wore the clothes I bought you. That makes you mine. And I've decided it's time you came home. Sandra's mind raced, calculating distances to exits, weighing options that all seemed equally hopeless. She was alone in the diner except for the mysterious customer in booth 7, and she had no reason to believe he would help her. Most people preferred not to get involved in domestic disputes, especially when one party looked like he could afford expensive lawyers. Let go of me, Sandra said, her voice stronger now despite the fear coursing through her veins. Marcus's grip tightened, and Sandra couldn't hide the wince of pain. That's not how this works, he said. You've had your fun playing independent, but it's time to stop pretending you can make it on your own. You need me, Sandra. You've always needed me. The quiet scrape of a chair against linoleum cut through the tension like a blade. Kong Taemin rose from his booth with fluid grace, his movements controlled and deliberate. He approached the counter with the unhurried confidence of someone who had never doubted his ability to handle any situation. Excuse me, Taemin said, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that made both Sandra and Marcus turn toward him. I believe the lady asked you to let her go. Marcus sized up the newcomer with the quick assessment of someone accustomed to intimidating others. The expensive suit registered, but Marcus had money too, and he had never met a problem that couldn't be solved with the right combination of charm and threats. This is a private conversation, Marcus replied, not releasing Sandra's wrist. Mind your own business. Taemin stepped closer, and Sandra noticed the way he moved, like a dancer or a fighter, every motion purposeful and controlled. When a woman asks to be left alone, Taemin said, his English precise and his tone conversational, that makes it everyone's business. There was something in his voice, a quality that suggested this was not a man who made idle threats or empty promises. Marcus felt it too, Sandra could see. The way his grip on her wrist loosened slightly, the way his posture shifted from aggressive to defensive. "Who the hell are you?" Marcus demanded, but the bluster had gone out of his voice. "Someone who doesn't like seeing women hurt," Tameen replied simply. His dark eyes fixed on Marcus with the intensity of a predator choosing its moment to strike. Sandra could feel the tension in the air like electricity before a storm. She had never seen Marcus back down from anyone, but something about the quiet man in the expensive suit had shifted the dynamic entirely. "Sandra," Marcus said, his voice taking on the wheedling tone she remembered from their early days together. "Be reasonable. We both know you can't survive without me. Who's going to pay for your little nursing school fantasy? Who's going to take care of you when you can't take care of yourself?" The words hit their intended target, dredging up all of Sandra's deepest fears about independence and survival. But before she could respond, Tameen spoke again. "I think," Tameen said, his voice soft but carrying absolute conviction, "you've said enough for one evening." Marcus finally released Sandra's wrist, but his blue eyes were bright with anger. "This isn't over, Sandra," he said, backing toward the door. "You know where to find me when you come to your senses." After Marcus left, the diner fell silent except for the hum of the fluorescent lights and the steady drip of the coffee maker. Sandra stood frozen behind the counter, her wrist throbbing where Marcus had grabbed her, her mind struggling to process what had just happened. Tameen returned to his booth as quietly as he had left it, settling back into his seat as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. But his dark eyes remained alert, watching the door, watching Sandra, cataloging every detail of her reaction to the encounter. Sandra realized she was still holding pieces of the broken mug in her trembling hands. She forced herself to move, to clean up the mess, to restore some semblance of normalcy to the situation. But she could feel Tameen's gaze on her, analytical and knowing, and she understood that her carefully constructed invisibility had been shattered as completely as the ceramic on the floor. "Your coffee," she said finally, approaching his table with a fresh mug. Her hands were steady now, but Tameen noticed the way she positioned herself near the edge of the booth, ready to flee if necessary. "Thank you," he replied, accepting the coffee without comment on the delay. Sandra hesitated, torn between gratitude and wariness. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For what you did." Tameen looked up at her, his expression unreadable. "Men like that," he said, "don't usually take no for an answer." The words carried weight, suggestion, knowledge of things Sandra didn't want to think about. She nodded, unable to trust her voice, and retreated to the safety of the counter. But as she went through the motions of her remaining shift, Sandra couldn't shake the feeling that her life had just taken a turn she hadn't anticipated. The mysterious customer in booth 7 had intervened when no one else would, had faced down Marcus with nothing more than quiet confidence and unspoken threats. And somewhere in the back of her mind, a small voice whispered that perhaps Marcus had been right about one thing. Perhaps she couldn't survive on her own. Perhaps she needed protection after all. The question was whether she was brave enough to accept it from a man whose very presence suggested that salvation might come at a price she wasn't prepared to pay. Sandra woke to the sound of sirens filtering through the thin walls of her studio apartment. She had managed only 3 hours of sleep after her shift ended, her mind replaying the confrontation at Murphy's diner like a broken record. The way Marcus had grabbed her wrist, the quiet authority in the stranger's voice, the feeling that something fundamental had shifted in her carefully controlled world. She reached for her phone, squinting at the bright screen. 7:30 in the morning. The local news app notification made her blood run cold. Local man dies in car explosion. Marcus Garrett, 29, was killed early this morning when his vehicle exploded outside his apartment complex on Southeast Morrison. Police are investigating the incident as suspicious. Garrett had no known enemies and no apparent connection to criminal activity. Sandra's hands began to shake so violently she nearly dropped the phone. She read the headline again, then a third time, her mind struggling to process the words. Marcus was dead. Marcus, who had threatened her just hours ago, who had promised that their conversation wasn't over, was gone. The relief hit her first, a wave of emotion so powerful it left her gasping. For the first time in 2 years, She didn't have to look over her shoulder, didn't have to plan escape routes or change her schedule or wake up in terror from dreams where he found her. The weight she had carried in her chest, the constant fear that had become as familiar as breathing, simply vanished. But relief was quickly followed by something darker. Guilt. Horror. The terrible certainty that this was not a coincidence. Sandra stumbled to her bathroom, gripping the sink as nausea rolled through her stomach. In the mirror, her reflection looked pale and haunted, her brown eyes wide with shock. She had wanted Marcus out of her life, had prayed for freedom from his threats and violence. But she had never wanted him dead. Had she? The question haunted her through her morning routine, through the mechanical process of showering and dressing for her day classes. She had 3 lectures at Portland Community College, part of the prerequisite courses for nursing school. Classes she had fought to attend, that Marcus had tried to prevent, claiming they were a waste of time and money. Now those classes seemed impossibly distant. How could she sit in Biology 201 and take notes on cellular respiration when a man who had terrorized her was lying in a morgue? By the time evening came, Sandra felt like she was moving through water. Every action required tremendous effort. Every thought circled back to the same terrible questions. She arrived at Murphy's Diner an hour early, needing the familiar routine to anchor herself to something real. The diner looked exactly the same as it had 12 hours ago. Red vinyl booths, buzzing fluorescent lights, the persistent smell of coffee and industrial cleaning solution. But Sandra felt like she was seeing it through glass, disconnected from the ordinary world around her. At exactly 10:30, Kong Taemin walked through the front door. He moved with the same controlled grace she remembered, his expensive black suit perfectly pressed despite the late hour. Tonight he wore a dark blue tie that brought out the intensity of his eyes, and his shoes were polished to a mirror shine. Everything about him suggested wealth and power, but Sandra noticed details she had missed before. The way he scanned the room before sitting down, the careful positioning that gave him a clear view of all entrances, the way his jacket hung, suggesting something heavy in an inner pocket. Sandra approached his usual booth with her heart hammering against her ribs. She had been dreading this moment, dreading the confirmation she might see in his eyes. "Good evening," she managed, her voice steadier than she felt. "The usual?" Kong Taemin looked up at her with those dark, penetrating eyes. "Please," he said simply, "and perhaps we could speak privately when you have a moment." Sandra's stomach clenched. She nodded, not trusting her voice, and retreated to prepare his coffee. Her hands trembled as she filled the mug, as she cut a slice of cherry pie. When she returned to his table, she found him watching her with an expression she couldn't read. "Sit," he said quietly, gesturing to the seat across from him. "I'm working," Sandra replied automatically. "There are no other customers," Taemin observed, his tone gentle but leaving no room for argument. Sandra glanced around the empty diner, then slid reluctantly into the booth. Up close, she could see the sharp lines of his face more clearly, the way his dark hair caught the light, the expensive watch on his wrist that probably cost more than she made in a year. "You heard about Mr. Garrett," Taemin said. It wasn't a question. Sandra's breath caught in her throat. "Yes," she whispered. "I'm sorry for your loss," he continued, but there was something in his tone that suggested he was not sorry at all. "We weren't together anymore," Sandra said quickly. "Haven't been for 8 months. But he was still causing you problems," Taemin observed, taking a sip of his coffee. Sandra stared at her hands, folded tightly in her lap. She didn't know how to respond, didn't know what he wanted her to say. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken truths. "Men like Marcus Garrett," Taemin said finally, his voice conversational, "often have more enemies than their friends realize. Sometimes those enemies decide to take action." Sandra looked up, meeting his gaze directly for the first time. "Are you saying someone killed him?" "I'm saying," Taemin replied carefully, "that violent men often meet violent ends." The words hung in the air between them, neither accusation nor confession, but something that felt like both. Sandra searched his face for some sign of emotion, some hint of guilt or satisfaction, but found only that same controlled intensity she had noticed before. "Did you?" Sandra began, then stopped. She couldn't finish the question, couldn't voice the terrible suspicion that was growing in her mind. "What I did," Taemin said, his voice low and precise, "was ensure that you would never have to see him again." Sandra's heart stopped. then began beating so fast she felt dizzy. He had just confessed to murder. Sitting across from her in a diner booth, drinking coffee and eating pie, this quiet man in an expensive suit had just admitted to killing another human being. Why, she breathed. Because, Tameen replied, setting down his coffee cup with deliberate care, I have experience with men who hurt women, and I have resources to make sure they stop permanently. Sandra felt like she was falling, like the ground had disappeared beneath her feet. This stranger had killed for her, had committed murder to protect someone he barely knew. The implications were staggering, terrifying, and somehow liberating all at once. You don't even know me, Sandra said, her voice barely audible. I know enough, Tameen replied. I know you work 3 jobs to pay for school. I know you've been saving money to disappear. I know someone has been hurting you for a long time, and that you're brave enough to fight back, but not strong enough to win. The accuracy of his assessment left Sandra speechless. How long had he been watching her? How much had he learned about her life just from observing her in this diner? What do you want from me? Sandra asked, dreading the answer. Tameen leaned back in his seat, his dark eyes never leaving her face. I want to offer you a choice, he said. You can continue as you are, working 3 jobs and saving pennies, hoping that the next Marcus Garrett doesn't find you. Or you can accept my protection. Protection, Sandra repeated, the word tasting strange on her tongue. Complete protection, Tameen clarified. A new life, safe from anyone who might wish to hurt you. Full funding for your education. Financial security. A future without fear. Sandra's mind reeled. It sounded too good to be true, which meant it probably was. And what would I have to do in return? You would live under my care, Tameen said, his voice taking on a formal quality. You would be loyal to me and to my interests. You would tell no one about our arrangement or about what you suspect regarding Mr. Garrett. In exchange, I would ensure your safety, your education, and your future. Sandra stared at him, trying to process what he was offering. It sounded like a business proposition, clean and simple, but she could sense layers beneath the words that she didn't understand. You're talking about being kept, Sandra said finally. Like a mistress. Tameen's expression didn't change. I'm talking about being protected, he corrected. What develops between us beyond that arrangement would be entirely your choice. The distinction felt important, though Sandra wasn't sure she understood it completely. She thought about her savings account, about the $8,000 that had seemed like such an impossible goal, about the years of school ahead of her, the constant struggle to stay ahead of rent and textbooks and survival. How much? She asked. $75,000 per year, Tameen replied without hesitation, plus full tuition and expenses for nursing school, plus a secure apartment and living expenses, plus protection from anyone who might threaten you. Sandra's breath caught. $75,000 was more than she made in 3 years combined. It was freedom from every financial worry, every sleepless night calculating bills and meals, and whether she could afford both rent and groceries. But it was also accepting help from a man who killed people. What happens if I say no? Sandra asked. You walk away, Tameen said simply. You never see me again. You continue your life as planned, and I wish you well. And if I betray you? If I tell someone what you've done? Tameen's eyes grew cold, and for the first time Sandra glimpsed the predator beneath his controlled exterior. Then our arrangement would end, he said quietly, and you would discover that Marcus Garrett was not my first problem to solve permanently. The threat was delivered with such calm certainty that Sandra felt ice form in her veins. She was sitting across from a killer, a man who spoke of murder like other people discuss the weather. Everything rational in her mind screamed at her to run, to get as far away from this dangerous stranger as possible. But she was tired of running, tired of being afraid, tired of counting pennies and working herself into exhaustion just to stay one step ahead of men like Marcus. There's something else you should know, Tameen continued, his voice softening slightly. Marcus Garrett wasn't just hurting you for his own satisfaction. He was gathering information about your habits, your schedule, your vulnerabilities. He had been in contact with certain organizations that specialize in acquiring young women for export. Sandra felt the color drain from her face. What are you saying? I'm saying that Mr. Garrett had sold information about you to human traffickers, Tameen explained, his tone matter-of-fact. You were going to disappear regardless of your savings account or your careful planning. The only question was whether it would happen on his timeline or theirs. The words hit Sandra like a physical blow. She had been so focused on escaping Marcus that she had never considered he might be connected to something larger, something worse. The thought that strangers had been watching her, planning to steal her life entirely, made her stomach churn with terror. "How do you know all this?" Sandra whispered. "Because," Tameen said, reaching into his jacket pocket and withdrawing a slim phone, "these are the kinds of men I spend my time eliminating." He placed the phone on the table between them, its surface black and expensive-looking. Sandra stared at it, understanding somehow that picking it up would change everything. That accepting this device would mean accepting his protection, accepting his world, accepting the violence that came with both. "You have until tomorrow night to decide," Tameen said, rising from the booth with fluid grace. "Keep the phone. When you're ready to be safe, call the only number in its memory." He left money on the table for his coffee and pie, far more than the items cost, and walked toward the door with that same controlled confidence. At the threshold, he paused and looked back at her. "Sandra," he said, his voice carrying easily across the empty diner, "you deserve to live without fear. Remember that when you're making your choice." After he left, Sandra sat alone in the booth, staring at the phone. It was heavier than she had expected, substantial and real in a way that made the entire conversation feel less like a dream and more like a crossroads. She thought about Marcus, about the relief she had felt at news of his death, about the terror that had controlled her life for 2 years, the constant vigilance and fear that had become as natural as breathing, about the revelation that her danger had been even greater than she realized, that strangers had been planning to steal her future entirely. She thought about nursing school, about the dream of helping people that had sustained her through the worst of her relationship with Marcus, about the impossible mathematics of survival on minimum wage, about the years of struggle that stretched ahead of her even if she managed to stay safe. And she thought about the quiet man in the expensive suit who had spoken of murder like other people discussed dinner plans, who had killed for her protection and offered her a future without asking for anything she wasn't willing to give. Sandra picked up the phone, feeling its weight in her palm. Tomorrow night felt very far away. 3 months after picking up the phone, Sandra Williams stood in front of floor-to-ceiling windows on the 20th floor of downtown Portland's most exclusive residential tower, watching the city spread out beneath her like a map of possibilities. The penthouse apartment was more luxurious than anywhere she had ever imagined living, with its marble countertops, hardwood floors, and furniture that looked like it belonged in a magazine. But what struck her most was the silence. For the first time in years, Sandra slept through the night without startling awake at every sound. She woke each morning in the king-sized bed that Kong Tameen had arranged for her, surrounded by Egyptian cotton sheets that cost more than her old monthly rent, and felt something she had almost forgotten existed: peace. The decision to accept his protection had taken her exactly 18 hours. She had spent that day working her shift at Murphy's Diner, the phone heavy in her pocket like a secret. Every time she looked at it, she remembered Tameen's words about human traffickers, about Marcus selling information about her movements and habits. The revelation that her danger had been far greater than she realized made her careful planning seem naive. Her $8,000 escape fund pathetically inadequate against enemies she had never known existed. When she finally called the number, Tameen had answered immediately, as if he had been waiting. The conversation had been brief and businesslike. An address, a time, instructions to bring only personal items of sentimental value, as everything else would be provided. Now, 12 weeks later, Sandra was halfway through her first semester at Portland State University, enrolled in the accelerated nursing program she had dreamed about since high school. Her textbooks were new, not used and highlighted by previous students. Her laptop was Topophthalene, capable of running any software her classes required. Her tuition was paid in full, along with lab fees and supplies that would have taken her years to afford on her own. She had quit all 3 of her jobs, though the transition had been jarring. After years of constant motion, of filling every hour with work or study or vigilance, the luxury of time felt almost uncomfortable. Tameen had noticed her restlessness and suggested she volunteer at the free clinic downtown, where she could gain practical experience while helping people who couldn't afford medical care. The work was challenging and rewarding, and it reminded her why she had wanted to become a nurse in the first place. Sandra heard the soft sound of the front door opening and closing, followed by the familiar rhythm of expensive shoes against hardwood. Tameen was home from whatever business occupied his days, and Sandra still felt a flutter of nervousness at his arrival. Not fear, exactly, but awareness. He moved through the world with such controlled intensity that his presence changed the energy of any space he occupied. "Good evening," she called from the kitchen, where she had been reviewing her notes for tomorrow's pathophysiology exam. "Sandra," Tameen replied, his voice carrying the faint accent that became more pronounced when he was tired. "How were your classes today?" This was their routine. Each evening, Tameen would arrive home between 6 and 7, depending on his schedule. They would share dinner and conversation, during which he would ask about her studies with the focused attention of someone who genuinely cared about her answers. Sandra had been surprised to discover that he read her textbooks, often staying up late to understand the medical concepts she was learning so their discussions could be more substantive. "Challenging," Sandra answered, closing her notebook and moving to the kitchen where she had prepared dinner. "We covered cardiac arrhythmias today. The professor said we need to memorize 12 different irregular heartbeat patterns by Thursday." Tameen appeared in the kitchen doorway, and Sandra noticed he had already removed his suit jacket and loosened his tie. His shirt was crisp white cotton, perfectly fitted across his broad shoulders, and his dark hair was slightly mussed from running his fingers through it. The small imperfection humanized him in a way that still caught her off guard. "That sounds complicated," he said, moving to wash his hands at the kitchen sink. Sandra had learned that Kang Tameen was a man of unexpected contrasts. He could discuss the elimination of human beings with chilling detachment, but he also cooked traditional Korean dishes with patient precision on weekends. He owned a penthouse worth millions of dollars, but he read her medical textbooks late into the night so he could understand her world better. He commanded fear and respect from dangerous men, but he had never once raised his voice to her or made her feel threatened in any way. "I made Korean-style beef and vegetables," Sandra said, gesturing to the meal she had prepared. "I followed the recipe you gave me, but I'm not sure I got the seasoning right." Tameen moved to examine her work, standing close enough that she could smell his cologne, something woodsy and expensive that had become reassuringly familiar. He tasted the sauce with a clean spoon, his expression thoughtful. "It's very good," he said, and Sandra could tell from his tone that he wasn't merely being polite. "You're learning quickly." They ate at the dining table that seated 8 but felt intimate when it was just the two of them. The conversation flowed easily, covering Sandra's classes, his legitimate business interests in real estate and shipping, current events, books they had both read. Tameen was an engaging conversationalist when he chose to be, with strong opinions and a dry sense of humor that emerged more frequently as the months passed. The evening routine had evolved naturally, neither of them acknowledging the growing comfort between them. After dinner, Tameen would retreat to his home office to handle business calls to Asia, where the time difference meant his associates were beginning their day. Sandra would study at the dining table, surrounded by textbooks and notes, occasionally asking him questions about concepts she found confusing. Tonight, as she struggled with the complex pathways of cardiac electrical conduction, Sandra found herself watching Tameen through the open office door. He sat behind a massive mahogany desk, speaking quietly in Korean while reviewing documents that looked important and confidential. The language transformed his voice, adding musical tones that English didn't capture. When he spoke his native language, he seemed more relaxed, more himself. Sandra had begun to understand that Kang Tameen was a man caught between worlds. His business required him to be ruthless and calculating, but in their shared domestic space, he revealed glimpses of someone gentler. Someone who remembered to buy her favorite coffee, who noticed when she was stressed about exams, who had learned to make her grandmother's cornbread recipe when Sandra mentioned missing it. The arrangement between them remained carefully undefined. Tameen had provided her with a beautiful bedroom and private bathroom, making no assumptions about physical intimacy. He treated her with respectful courtesy, like an honored houseguest rather than a kept woman. Sometimes Sandra caught him watching her with an expression she couldn't interpret, but he never pressured her for anything beyond what she willingly offered. As the weeks passed, Sandra found herself offering more. Conversations that stretched late into the evening. Shared meals that felt less like obligation and more like companionship. questions about his life and work that revealed genuine curiosity rather than mere politeness. "What exactly do you do?" Sandra had asked one evening, emboldened by wine and weeks of growing trust. "I solve problems," Tamien had replied carefully. "What kind of problems?" "The kind that law enforcement can't or won't address," he said, meeting her gaze steadily. "The kind that threaten innocent people." Sandra had understood that she was being offered a glimpse behind the careful facade he maintained. "Like when people hurt women and the police can't protect them," she said. Among other things, yes. It was the closest he had come to directly acknowledging what he had done to Marcus, and Sandra had felt a complex mix of emotions. Gratitude for his protection, horror at the violence he was capable of, and something else, something that felt dangerously like admiration for a man who used his power to defend people who couldn't defend themselves. Tonight, as she studied and he worked, Sandra realized how completely her life had changed. 3 months ago, she had been exhausted and afraid, working 3 jobs to save for an escape that might not have saved her anyway. Now she attended classes at one of the state's top nursing programs, lived in luxury, and felt safer than she ever had in her adult life. The transformation hadn't been without challenges. Sandra had struggled with accepting expensive gifts, feeling like she was being bought rather than protected. Tamien had quickly learned to offer experiences rather than objects. Concert tickets instead of jewelry. Dinner at restaurants, she mentioned wanting to try rather than designer clothes. Books related to her studies rather than expensive electronics. She was reviewing a particularly complex diagram of heart valves when a sound from the hallway made her blood run cold. It was nothing dramatic, just the soft scrape of shoes against carpet, but it triggered a memory so vivid that her heart began racing. For a moment, she was back in her old apartment, listening to Marcus's footsteps approaching her door, knowing that nothing good would follow. Sandra's breathing became shallow and rapid, her hands trembling as the textbook slipped from her fingers. She gripped the edge of the table, fighting against the panic that rose in her throat like bile. Logically, she knew she was safe. Tamien's building had security that screened every visitor, and the penthouse was accessible only by private elevator with a key card. But trauma didn't respond to logic. Tamien appeared beside her so quietly that she startled, a small cry escaping her lips before she could stop it. His dark eyes took in her pale face, her shaking hands, the textbooks scattered on the floor, and his expression shifted to something Sandra had never seen before. Not anger or irritation, but a fierce protectiveness that made her breath catch for an entirely different reason. "What is it?" he asked, his voice gentle despite the intensity in his eyes. "Nothing," Sandra said quickly, embarrassed by her reaction. "I just thought I heard something." "It's stupid." Tamien crouched beside her chair, bringing himself to her eye level without crowding her. "It's not stupid," he said firmly. "You've spent years listening for danger. Those instincts don't disappear overnight." He waited patiently while her breathing returned to normal, his presence somehow both calming and protective. When she finally looked up to meet his gaze, Sandra saw something she hadn't expected: understanding. This man, who seemed so controlled and unshakable, knew what it felt like to be haunted by memories. "Would it help to walk through the security protocols again?" Tamien asked. "So you can remind yourself how safe you are here?" Sandra nodded, grateful for his practical approach. Together they reviewed the building's security systems, the cameras that monitored every entrance, the guards who verified every visitor. Tamien showed her the panic button he had installed in every room, connected directly to his personal security team. He explained the bulletproof glass in the windows, the reinforced door that could withstand any attempt at forced entry. "You're safer here than in most government buildings," he concluded. "No one can reach you without my knowledge and permission." As her panic subsided, Sandra felt something shift between them. Tamien had seen her at her most vulnerable and responded with kindness rather than impatience. He hadn't dismissed her fears or tried to rush her recovery. Instead, he had met her where she was and offered concrete reassurance. "Thank you," Sandra said quietly, "for understanding. I've seen what trauma can do to strong people," Tamien replied. "It's not a weakness to carry those scars." The conversation revealed another layer of the complex man who had taken her under his protection. Sandra had assumed that someone in his position would have little patience for emotional fragility, But Tameen seemed to understand the lasting effects of violence with an intimacy that suggested personal experience. 2 weeks later, Sandra encountered a situation that tested everything she thought she knew about herself and about the man who protected her. She was walking home from the university library, taking a route through the downtown area that Tameen had cleared as safe. The early November evening was crisp and clear, and Sandra enjoyed the opportunity to walk rather than ride in one of Tameen's cars with their bulletproof glass and professional drivers. As she passed an alley between two office buildings, Sandra heard a sound that made her stop, a low moan of pain, barely audible above the city traffic. Every instinct told her to keep walking, to avoid involvement in whatever situation was unfolding in the shadows. But her nursing training overrode her caution. Sandra found a man in his 60s collapsed against the brick wall, clutching his chest and struggling to breathe. His face was gray with pain, and Sandra recognized the signs immediately: myocardial infarction, heart attack. Without immediate medical intervention, he would die. She knelt beside him, her hands automatically checking his pulse while her mind calculated options. The nearest hospital was 6 blocks away. An ambulance would take at least 10 minutes to arrive and navigate downtown traffic. He didn't have 10 minutes. "Sir," Sandra said firmly, trying to get his attention. "Can you hear me? I'm a nursing student. I'm going to help you." The man's eyes focused on her with desperate hope. "Can't breathe," he gasped. Sandra pulled out her phone and dialed 911 while simultaneously assessing his condition. She guided him to a position that would ease his breathing, loosened his tie and collar, and began the basic interventions she had learned in her emergency medicine rotation. She stayed with him, monitoring his vital signs and providing reassurance until the paramedics arrived. Only after the ambulance pulled away did Sandra realize she was no longer alone in the alley. Kong Tameen stood at the entrance, partially concealed by shadows, watching her with an expression she couldn't read. How long he had been there, she didn't know, but something in his posture suggested he had observed the entire interaction. "You were supposed to come directly home," he said as they walked toward his car. "I know," Sandra replied, "but he would have died if I hadn't stopped." "I know," Tameen said simply. They drove home in comfortable silence, but Sandra could feel something significant had changed between them. That evening, over dinner, Tameen asked her about her medical training, about the procedures she had performed, about her plans for specialization after graduation. His questions revealed a depth of interest that went beyond polite conversation. "You have good instincts," he told her as they finished eating. "You stayed calm under pressure, made correct decisions, potentially saved a life. These are rare qualities." Sandra felt warmth spread through her chest at his praise. She had acted on pure instinct, but knowing that Tameen respected her choice filled her with something that felt dangerously like pride. Later that evening, as she studied for her upcoming exams, Sandra reflected on how much her life had changed. 3 months ago, she had been afraid of her own shadow, jumping at every unexpected sound. Tonight, she had knelt in an alley and saved a stranger's life without hesitation. She was becoming someone new under Kong Tameen's protection, someone stronger, someone who could help others instead of merely surviving. And as she watched him through the office door, speaking quietly in Korean while managing his complex business interests, Sandra realized that she was beginning to care about this dangerous man who had given her back her life. The knowledge should have frightened her. Instead, it felt like coming home. The question had been building in Sandra's mind for weeks, growing stronger with each evening they shared dinner, each conversation that revealed another layer of the complex man who had taken her under his protection. By late December, with finals behind her and the first semester of nursing school successfully completed, she finally found the courage to ask. "Why me?" she said one evening as they sat in the living room, the city lights twinkling below through the floor-to-ceiling windows. "Why do you help women like me?" Kong Tameen looked up from the financial reports he had been reviewing, his dark eyes meeting hers across the space. It was a question he had been expecting, she realized, though he took his time formulating an answer. "What makes you think there have been others?" he asked carefully. Sandra set down her medical journal, giving him her full attention. "The way you knew exactly what to look for with Marcus. The way you understood my panic attack without explanation. The way you've set up this entire arrangement like you've done it before. You have experience with men who hurt women. You said so yourself." Taemin closed the folder in his lap, his movements deliberate and controlled. He was quiet for a long moment, and Sandra could see him weighing what to tell her, how much truth she could handle. There have been others, he confirmed finally. Not many, not often. But when I encounter a situation like yours, I intervene. But why? Sandra pressed. You're a businessman. You have your own concerns, your own problems to solve. Why risk getting involved in domestic violence cases? Something shifted in Taemin's expression, a crack in the carefully maintained composure that had become so familiar to her. For the first time since she had known him, he looked uncertain, almost vulnerable. Because, he said quietly, I failed to help someone once. Someone who mattered more than anything else in the world. Sandra waited, sensing that pushing would only make him retreat. The silence stretched between them, filled with the soft hum of the building's climate control and the distant sound of traffic 20 floors below. I had a sister, Taemin said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Younger than me by 6 years. Her name was Minji. The past tense registered immediately, and Sandra felt her heart constrict with sympathy. She had wondered about his family, about the people who had shaped the man he had become, but Taemin rarely spoke of personal matters. She was everything good in a world that's mostly dark, Taemin continued, his gaze fixed on the city lights outside. Sweet, kind, trusting. She believed the best of people even when she had every reason not to. She wanted to be a teacher, wanted to help children learn and grow. She had this laugh that could fill an entire room with joy. Sandra could hear the pain in his voice, carefully controlled but unmistakably present. She had never seen this side of him, this raw emotion beneath the polished exterior. When she was 22, Minji met a man named Park Junho, Taemin said. He was charming, successful, everything our parents wanted for her. He worked in finance, drove an expensive car, brought her flowers and took her to nice restaurants. Everyone thought he was perfect. Sandra felt a chill of recognition. She knew where this story was heading, could see the familiar pattern emerging. But flowers and expensive dinners don't tell you who someone really is, Taemin continued. They don't reveal what happens behind closed doors when no one else is watching. Taemin stood up, moving to the window where he could look out over the city that had become his domain. His reflection in the glass looked tired, haunted in a way that expensive suits and controlled composure couldn't hide. The signs were there, he said, his voice heavy with self-recrimination. She started calling less frequently. When we had family dinners, she would wear long sleeves even in summer. She became quiet, withdrawn, not the laughing girl we all knew. She made excuses when we invited her places, always saying Junho had other plans for them. Sandra's throat tightened as she recognized the same patterns she had followed with Marcus. The isolation, the excuses, the careful concealment of bruises and fear. I was building my empire then, Taemin continued, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. 28 years old, and convinced I was going to control half of Seoul's underground economy within 5 years. Every conversation with Minji was interrupted by phone calls about territory disputes or shipping schedules or which officials needed to be paid off. I was too busy becoming powerful to notice my sister was dying by inches. The word dying hung in the air between them, and Sandra felt tears prick at her eyes. She wanted to comfort him, to offer some word of reassurance, but she sensed he needed to finish the story. She tried to tell me, Taemin said, his voice breaking slightly. Called me one night, crying, saying she was scared and didn't know what to do. But I was in the middle of negotiations with the Yakuza about port access, and I told her we would talk later. I promised to call her back when I finished my meeting. Sandra closed her eyes, anticipating the devastating conclusion. I never called her back, Taemin whispered. The negotiations went long, then I had dinner with potential investors, then I had to deal with a problem at one of our warehouses. By the time I remembered her call, it was 3 a.m, and I thought she would be sleeping. I told myself I would call her in the morning. The silence that followed was heavy with grief and regret. Sandra could barely breathe, imagining the young woman who had reached out for help that never came. Park Junho killed her that night, Taemin said, his voice flat and emotionless now. Beat her to death in their apartment, and then fled the country before anyone found her body. By the time the police involved me, he was already in Thailand with a new identity and enough money to disappear forever. Sandra stood and moved toward him, her heart breaking for the pain she could see in every line of his body. The guilt he carried was visible now, written in the set of his shoulders and the tightness around his eyes. "She called you for help," Sandra said softly, finally understanding the depth of his motivation. "She called me because she trusted me to protect her," Tameen replied. "Because she believed her big brother would always keep her safe. And I failed her because I thought my business was more important than her fear." Sandra reached out tentatively, placing her hand on his arm. Through the expensive fabric of his shirt, she could feel the tension in his muscles, the way he held himself rigid against the pain. "You couldn't have known," she said. Tameen turned to face her, his dark eyes bright with unshed tears. "I should have known. I should have paid attention. I should have dropped everything and gone to her the moment I heard fear in her voice." The raw emotion in his confession took Sandra's breath away. This powerful man, who commanded respect and fear from dangerous criminals, who solved problems with cold efficiency and controlled violence, was breaking apart with guilt over a sister he couldn't save. "Is that why you help women like me?" Sandra asked gently. "Because you couldn't help her?" "Because I won't fail again," Tameen replied, his voice steady despite the pain in his eyes. "Because every woman I protect is a chance to honor Minji's memory. Because maybe if I save enough people, if I prevent enough tragedies, I can find some way to forgive myself for that phone call I never returned." Sandra felt tears spill down her cheeks as she finally understood the man who had become her protector. All his careful attention to her safety, his immediate response to threats, his willingness to eliminate problems permanently, stemmed from a promise to a dead sister who would never know how many lives he had saved in her name. Without thinking, Sandra stepped closer and wrapped her arms around him. For a moment, Tameen stood frozen, as if he had forgotten how to accept comfort. Then his arms came around her, holding her tightly against his chest, and Sandra could feel the tremors that ran through his powerful frame. "She would have been proud of you," Sandra whispered against his shoulder. "Minji would have been proud of the man you became, of all the women you've saved." Tameen's hold on her tightened, and Sandra felt something warm and wet against her hair. They stood together in the quiet of the penthouse, two broken people finding solace in shared understanding, while the city continued its restless motion 20 floors below. When they finally separated, something fundamental had changed between them. The careful distance Tameen had maintained, the formal courtesy that had defined their relationship, had dissolved entirely. Sandra looked into his dark eyes and saw not the controlled criminal or the wealthy benefactor, but a man who carried grief like a physical weight and had chosen to transform his pain into protection for others. "Thank you," Sandra said quietly, "for telling me, for trusting me with her memory." Tameen cupped her face gently, his thumb brushing away the tears on her cheek. "Thank you for understanding," he replied, "for seeing past what I do to why I do it." The moment stretched between them, intimate and fragile, until the harsh buzz of Tameen's phone shattered the quiet. He answered immediately, his expression shifting from vulnerable to alert as he listened to whoever was calling. "When," he said sharply, switching to Korean for a rapid exchange that Sandra couldn't understand but recognized as urgent. His face grew increasingly grim as the conversation continued. "What is it?" Sandra asked when he hung up. "We have a problem," Tameen said, his protective instincts overriding everything else. "You've been followed for the past 3 days. Professional surveillance, not random criminals. Someone is gathering information about your movements, your schedule, your vulnerabilities." Sandra felt her blood turn cold. "Who would want to watch me?" "People who want to hurt me," Tameen replied, his voice taking on the hard edge she remembered from their first meeting. "In my world, the people we care about become targets. I had hoped that keeping our relationship private would protect you, but it seems someone has identified you as important to me." The implications hit Sandra like a physical blow. By accepting Tameen's protection, she had also inherited his enemies. The safety she had found was built on a foundation that could be destroyed by anyone with enough resources and motivation to strike at him through her. "What does that mean?" Sandra asked, though she already suspected the answer. "It means you can't go back to your old routine," Tameen said grimly. "No more walking to the library alone. No more classes without security. No more pretending you're just another nursing student living a normal life." He moved to his home office, returning with a thick folder that he placed on the coffee table. The photographs inside made Sandra's stomach clench with fear. Images of herself walking across campus, entering the library, shopping for groceries. Someone had been watching her for days, cataloging her habits with professional thoroughness. These were taken by a team that specializes in kidnapping and leverage, Tameen explained. They've been hired by someone who wants to use you against me. Sandra stared at the photographs, seeing her ordinary life transformed into something sinister. Every moment of freedom she had enjoyed, every simple pleasure of normal student existence, had been observed and recorded by people who meant her harm. What do we do? She asked. We disappear, Tameen said simply. Tonight. I'm moving you to a location where no one can reach you without going through me first. Within 2 hours, Sandra found herself in the back of an armored car, watching Portland's city lights fade behind them as they drove toward the mountains. Beside her, Tameen spoke quietly into his phone, coordinating security measures in 3 languages. The man who had shared his deepest grief with her was gone, replaced by the cold strategist who had built an empire through careful planning and decisive action. The estate they reached after an hour of winding mountain roads was a fortress disguised as a luxury retreat. Set on hundreds of acres of private land, surrounded by walls and security systems that Tameen's team had spent years perfecting, it offered the kind of protection that money alone couldn't buy. As Sandra stood in the main house, surrounded by armed guards who treated Tameen with the respect due to absolute authority, she finally understood the full reality of the world she had entered. The penthouse in Portland had been comfortable, but this was his true domain. Here, Kong Tameen was not just a wealthy businessman with unusual hobbies. He was the center of an organization that commanded loyalty and fear in equal measure. You're safe here, Tameen told her as they stood in the master bedroom that had been prepared for her arrival. No one can reach you without my permission. No one can hurt you without going through me first. Sandra looked around the room, taking in the luxury that couldn't quite hide the reality of what it was, a beautiful prison. The windows were bulletproof, the doors reinforced, the entire structure designed to keep the world out as much as to keep her in. For how long? She asked. Until I eliminate the threat permanently, Tameen replied. However long that takes. As Sandra settled into bed that night, surrounded by security systems and armed guards, she realized that accepting Kong Tameen's protection had changed her life in ways she was only beginning to understand. She was no longer Sandra Williams, nursing student and former waitress. She was something more dangerous and more valuable, the weakness of a powerful man, the vulnerability that his enemies would exploit if given the chance. But as she remembered the grief in his eyes when he spoke of Minji, the way he had held her when he shared his deepest pain, Sandra knew she wouldn't trade this dangerous love for all the normal safety in the world. He had saved her from one kind of prison only to place her in another, but this cage was built from devotion rather than control, protection rather than possession. And for the first time since Marcus had grabbed her wrist in a diner months ago, Sandra felt truly, completely safe. Sandra woke to the sound of breaking glass and automatic weapons fire. Her first instinct was to hide, drop to the floor, find cover, disappear. The training that trauma had burned into her nervous system screamed at her to make herself small and invisible until the danger passed. But the sound that followed made her blood freeze in her veins. A man's voice, crying out in pain from somewhere in the house. Sandra grabbed the medical kit that Kong Tameen had insisted be placed in every room, her nursing training overriding her survival instincts. Someone was hurt. Someone needed help. Everything else was secondary. She crept to the bedroom door, pressing her ear against the reinforced wood. The gunfire had stopped, but she could hear movement in the hallway. Multiple footsteps. Urgent voices speaking in Korean. The sound of someone giving rapid orders. Against every rational thought in her mind, Sandra opened the door. The hallway was a scene from a nightmare. Bullet holes pocked the walls. 2 of Tameen's security team lay bleeding on the hardwood floor. One was unconscious, a spreading pool of crimson beneath his shoulder. The other was awake but gray with shock, his hands pressed against a wound in his abdomen. Sandra dropped to her knees beside the injured man, her hands moving with the efficiency her professors had drilled into her. Pressure to stop the bleeding. Assessment for signs of internal damage. Airway clear, breathing shallow but steady. You're going to be okay, she told him in English, hoping he understood. I'm a nurse. I'm going to help you. The man's eyes widened in recognition, then shifted to something behind her. Sandra turned to find Kong Taemin standing at the end of the hallway, and for the first time since she had known him, he looked genuinely shaken. The transformation was immediate and complete. The man who had shared his deepest grief with her 12 hours earlier was gone. In his place stood someone Sandra barely recognized, cold, calculating, absolutely lethal. His expensive suit was torn and bloodied. His dark hair was disheveled. His eyes held the focused intensity of a predator backed into a corner. "Get her to the safe room," Taemin said sharply to someone Sandra couldn't see. "No," Sandra replied, her hands still working to stabilize the wounded man. "He needs medical attention." "They both do." Taemin moved toward her with fluid grace despite the chaos around them. "Sandra, this is not a discussion. There are professional killers in my house. You need to be behind reinforced steel until I eliminate them." "How many are hurt?" Sandra asked, ignoring his command. Taemin paused, studying her face. In that moment of assessment, Sandra saw him recognize something. She wasn't going to abandon injured people, regardless of the danger to herself. The knowledge seemed to surprise and concern him in equal measure. "For injured," Taemin said finally. "Too critical." "Then I'm staying," Sandra replied firmly. "You can protect me better if your men aren't bleeding to death." For a heartbeat, Taemin looked like he might physically carry her to safety. Then his expression shifted to something that might have been admiration mixed with frustration. "You have 10 minutes, he said. "Then you go to the safe room whether you're finished or not." What followed was the most intense 10 minutes of Sandra's life. Working with supplies from the medical kits placed throughout the house, she stabilized bleeding, administered emergency medications, and performed the kind of field medicine she had only read about in textbooks. The man with the abdominal wound was the most serious case. Sandra worked with steady hands to control hemorrhaging while monitoring his vital signs, talking him through the procedures to keep him calm and conscious. "What's your name?" she asked as she worked. "Kim Jinwoo," he replied in accented English. "Well, Jinwoo, you're going to live to see your family again," Sandra told him. "But you need to stay with me. Keep talking. Tell me about your family." As Jinwoo spoke about his wife and daughter, Sandra became aware of movement throughout the house. Taemin's voice, giving orders in rapid Korean. The sound of vehicles arriving. Men with weapons taking positions. The efficient coordination of professionals preparing for war. When the 10 minutes expired, Sandra had stabilized all 4 wounded men and established treatment protocols that would keep them alive until proper medical care could arrive. Taemin appeared beside her, his expression grim. "Time's up," he said, helping her to her feet. The safe room was located in the basement, behind a door that looked like steel and probably was. The space was larger than Sandra had expected, furnished like a luxury apartment, but with no windows and walls thick enough to stop military-grade weapons. Computer monitors showed camera feeds from throughout the property. Communication equipment connected to networks Sandra couldn't identify. "You'll be safe here," Taemin said, his hands cupping her face gently. "Whatever you hear, whatever happens, you stay in this room until I come for you personally." "What are you going to do?" Sandra asked, though she already knew the answer. "What I do best," Taemin replied, his voice taking on the cold edge she remembered from their first meeting. "I'm going to eliminate a problem permanently." He kissed her then, fierce and desperate, as if it might be the last time. Sandra kissed him back with equal intensity, pouring months of growing feelings into the connection. When they separated, his dark eyes held a promise and a warning. "I will come back to you," he said, "but the man who returns may not be the same one who leaves." Sandra understood what he meant. She had seen glimpses of the ruthless enforcer beneath his controlled exterior, but tonight he would unleash the full extent of his capabilities. The violence necessary to protect her would transform him, at least temporarily, into someone she might not recognize. "Stay alive," she whispered. "Come back to me." After Taemin left, Sandra settled in to wait. The monitors showed armed men taking positions throughout the estate, vehicles moving in coordinated patterns. The systematic preparation for a battle that would determine whether she lived or died. The attack came at dawn. Sandra watched through the security cameras as black SUVs approached the estate from multiple directions. Professional killers emerged from the vehicles, moving with military precision toward predetermined targets. These weren't random criminals or opportunistic kidnappers. They were specialists, hired by someone with substantial resources and specific objectives. The gunfire was intense, but brief. Tamin's team had the advantage of prepared positions and superior firepower, but the attackers had numbers and the element of coordinated assault. Sandra found herself holding her breath as she watched Kong Tamin move through the chaos like a deadly dancer. He appeared on different camera feeds, always where the fighting was most intense, always making the shots that mattered most. His movements were economical, precise, absolutely lethal. This was not the man who had cooked Korean food for her or stayed up late discussing medical ethics. This was the criminal mastermind who had built an empire through calculated violence and strategic elimination of threats. Watching him work, Sandra finally understood why people spoke his name with fear and respect in equal measure. The battle lasted less than an hour. When the shooting stopped, 12 attackers lay dead on Tamin's property. 3 of his own men had been killed. The survivors were professionals who had faced death before, but Sandra could see the cost of victory in their movements, their expressions, the way they handled the aftermath with grim efficiency. Tamin appeared on the monitor showing the main hallway, and Sandra's heart clenched at what she saw. His expensive suit was ruined, torn and blood-stained. His face was hard, emotionless, marked by violence. When he moved, it was with the controlled grace of someone who had just killed multiple human beings and felt nothing about it. Sandra realized she was looking at the real Kong Tamin, not the careful gentleman who had courted her with respect and patience, but the enforcer who eliminated problems with cold efficiency. The man who had built his empire on the bodies of people who threatened what he claimed as his own. When the safe room door opened, Sandra was ready for the stranger she expected to see. Instead, the moment Tamin's eyes found hers, his expression cracked. The cold mask fell away, revealing exhaustion and relief and something that looked like desperate love. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his hands moving over her face and arms with careful thoroughness. "I'm fine," Sandra replied. "Are you?" Tamin pulled her against his chest, holding her with an intensity that spoke of fear finally released. "I'm alive," he said simply. "We're both alive." Over his shoulder, Sandra could see the aftermath through the open door. Bodies being moved, blood being cleaned from expensive marble floors. The evidence of violence being efficiently erased by people who had done this work many times before. "Who were they?" Sandra asked quietly. "The Chin Syndicate," Tamin replied, his voice muffled against her hair. "Based in Vancouver. They wanted to use you as leverage to force me out of the shipping lanes between Seattle and Portland. And now? Now they're extinct," Tamin said with cold finality. "I spent the last 6 hours eliminating their leadership, their operations, and their ability to threaten anyone ever again." Sandra pulled back to look at his face, seeing the truth written in the hard lines around his eyes. In 6 hours, Kong Tamin had destroyed an entire criminal organization. Not just the people who had attacked them, but everyone associated with the threat. Everyone who had contributed to the decision to target her. The efficiency of it was staggering. The ruthlessness was absolute. And Sandra realized that she should be horrified. Instead, she felt safer than she ever had in her life. "I killed 18 people tonight," Tamin said, his voice flat and emotionless. "Directly or through orders to my team. Some of them may have had families. Some of them were probably just following orders from people they feared more than they feared death." Sandra listened to his confession, understanding that he was giving her the chance to walk away. To reject the man he really was beneath the careful facade he had maintained for her benefit. But as she looked into his dark eyes, Sandra saw not a monster, but a protector. Someone who had transformed his grief over a lost sister into absolute dedication to defending the people he cared about. Someone who would face any danger, pay any price, commit any violence necessary to keep her safe. "You did what you had to do," Sandra said simply. "To protect me. To protect us." Tamin's eyes searched her face, looking for signs of fear or revulsion. Instead, he found acceptance, understanding, and something that looked remarkably like love. "I need you to know," he said quietly, "that this is who I am. Not the man who cooks dinner and discusses your medical textbooks, but the one who eliminates threats without hesitation. Both versions are real, but this is the foundation everything else is built on." "I know," Sandra replied, "and I'm not going anywhere." She meant it. Standing in a basement safe room, surrounded by the aftermath of violence. Sandra Williams finally understood what she had chosen when she picked up the phone 3 months ago. She hadn't just accepted protection from a wealthy criminal. She had become part of a world where love was expressed through absolute dedication and safety was maintained through decisive action against anyone who posed a threat. It should have terrified her. Instead, as Kong Taemin kissed her with desperate intensity, Sandra felt a completeness she had never experienced before. She had found her place in his dangerous world, not as a victim to be protected, but as a partner who understood what his protection required. When they finally separated, both breathing hard, Taemin rested his forehead against hers. "I love you," he said simply. "More than my empire. More than my own life. More than anything I thought I was capable of loving after Minji died." "I love you too," Sandra replied, the words coming easily despite everything she had witnessed. "Your darkness and your light. Your violence and your tenderness. All of it." As dawn broke over the mountains, casting light through the bulletproof windows of Taemin's estate, Sandra realized that she had found something she never knew she was looking for. A love worth fighting for, worth killing for, worth building an empire to protect. The price of that love was accepting a world where threats were eliminated permanently and safety was maintained through superior firepower. But as she stood in the arms of the man who had just destroyed an entire criminal organization to keep her safe, Sandra discovered that some prices were worth paying. Some kinds of love required darkness to survive. 6 months after the Chun Syndicate ceased to exist, Sandra Williams stood at the podium in Portland State University's auditorium, valedictorian of her nursing class, looking out at an audience that included professors, fellow graduates, proud families, and one impeccably dressed Korean man who had made her success possible. Kong Taemin sat in the third row, his dark eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her heart race even after all this time. His presence commanded attention without effort, the expensive charcoal suit and perfect posture marking him as someone important, someone who belonged wherever he chose to be. In her valedictorian speech, Sandra spoke about resilience, about the capacity of human beings to heal from trauma and build meaningful lives from the ashes of their worst experiences. She talked about the responsibility that came with medical knowledge, the obligation to use skills and resources to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. She didn't mention that her understanding of protection had been shaped by a man who eliminated threats with surgical precision, or that her education had been funded by money earned through carefully controlled violence. The audience heard inspirational platitudes about overcoming adversity. Taemin heard a love letter disguised as academic rhetoric. After the ceremony, as photographs were taken and congratulations were offered, Sandra noticed the subtle security presence that surrounded them. Taemin's people, positioned throughout the crowd, ensuring that this moment of celebration remained peaceful. Even here, surrounded by academics and proud families, they lived in a world where vigilance was the price of safety. "We should celebrate," Sandra said as they walked toward Taemin's car, her nursing degree finally complete after 2 years of dedicated study. "We will," Taemin replied, opening the passenger door for her with the courtesy that had never wavered despite everything they had been through. "But first, there's something I want to show you." The drive took them away from the university, away from the city, toward the mountains where Taemin's estate offered privacy and security. But instead of going to the main house, he directed the driver to a property Sandra had never seen before. A smaller residence, set on its own section of the extensive grounds, surrounded by gardens that looked professionally maintained. "What is this place?" Sandra asked as they approached the front door. "Home," Taemin replied simply. "If you want it to be." The house was perfect. Not the intimidating grandeur of the main estate, but something more intimate. Warm hardwood floors, floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the mountain landscape, a kitchen designed for people who actually cooked rather than merely displayed wealth. Everything was new but felt comfortable, as if it had been designed specifically for the life they had built together. In the master bedroom, Sandra found her belongings from the penthouse apartment, arranged exactly as she had left them. Her medical textbooks lined the shelves beside Taemin's business journals. Her photographs shared space with his art collection. Her simple jewelry box sat on the same dresser as his expensive watch collection. "You did this for me," Sandra said, understanding flooding through her. "I did this for us," Taemin corrected, moving to stand behind her. His arms circled her waist, pulling her back against his chest. I want you to have a place that belongs to both of us, not just somewhere you're staying under my protection. Sandra leaned into his embrace, feeling the solid warmth of his body against her back. Over the past months, their relationship had evolved from careful courtship to deep intimacy. They shared everything now: fears, dreams, the mundane details of daily life, and the extraordinary challenges of loving someone whose enemies considered her a target. The physical relationship had developed gradually, built on trust and genuine affection rather than the transaction that had originally defined their arrangement. Tameen had never pressured her, never assumed that his protection entitled him to anything beyond what she freely offered. When Sandra finally came to his bed, it was because she wanted to be there, not because she felt obligated. Now, standing in a home he had created for their shared future, Sandra felt the last barriers between them dissolve completely. "There's something I need to tell you," Tameen said, his voice taking on the formal tone he used for important pronouncements. "Something I should have said months ago." Sandra turned in his arms, looking up into his dark eyes. Whatever it was, she could see its importance written in the careful control of his expression. "You're mine, Sandra," Tameen said, his voice low and intense. "Not because I protect you or pay for your education or eliminated the people who threatened you. You're mine because I love you more than I've ever loved anything. Because I can't imagine a future that doesn't include you. Because you've become the center of everything I am." The possession in his voice should have triggered her old fears about controlling men and trapped relationships. Instead, it sent heat racing through her veins. This wasn't Marcus's crude ownership or demand for submission. This was a claim of love, a statement of devotion that came with protection and partnership rather than domination. "And you're mine," Sandra replied, her hands moving to frame his face. "Your darkness and your light, your violence and your tenderness, your past and your future. All of it belongs to me now." Tameen's control cracked at her words, the careful composure giving way to raw emotion. He kissed her with desperate intensity, months of careful restraint finally breaking down. Sandra kissed him back with equal fervor, pouring her love and acceptance and complete trust into the connection. When they separated, both breathing hard, Tameen reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a small velvet box. Sandra's heart stopped as he dropped to one knee in the bedroom of the home he had built for them. "I want you to be my wife, Sandra," he said, opening the box to reveal a ring that took her breath away. "Not just the woman I protect or the person I love, but my partner in everything. The official matriarch of everything I've built." The ring was perfect, elegant but not ostentatious, expensive but not gaudy. A solitaire diamond surrounded by smaller stones, set in platinum that caught the light from the mountain sunset streaming through the windows. But more than the ring, more than the house, more than any of the material expressions of his devotion, what moved Sandra was the vulnerability in Tameen's eyes. This powerful man, who commanded respect and fear from dangerous criminals, was asking her to choose him, offering her everything he had built and trusting her with his heart and his future. "Yes," Sandra said simply. "Yes to all of it." Tameen slipped the ring onto her finger with hands that trembled slightly, then stood to kiss her again. This time the kiss held promises of shared tomorrows, of challenges faced together, of a love strong enough to survive in a world where devotion was expressed through absolute protection and threats were eliminated permanently. The engagement celebration was small but meaningful. Tameen's core team, the men who had risked their lives to protect them both, offered congratulations with genuine warmth. Several of the women he had helped over the years sent flowers and notes, creating an unexpected community of people whose lives had been touched by his particular brand of justice. Sandra's family required more delicate handling. Her grandmother, the only relative she remained close to, had been curious about the wealthy boyfriend who had suddenly appeared in Sandra's life. Tameen handled the meeting with careful charm, presenting himself as a successful businessman who had recognized Sandra's exceptional qualities and wanted to support her dreams. It wasn't technically a lie, though it left out significant details about the methods he used to maintain his success. Sandra's grandmother liked him immediately, won over by his respectful courtesy and obvious devotion to Sandra. When he arranged for the best cardiac specialists in the country to monitor her heart condition, providing care that would have been impossible on her fixed income, Sandra's grandmother declared him perfect marriage material. The wedding itself was a masterpiece of controlled elegance, held at the estate's main house, with security that was invisible but absolute. It combined Korean traditions that honored Taemin's heritage with American customs that reflected Sandra's background. The guest list was carefully curated. People who could be trusted with the knowledge of their relationship, who understood the unique circumstances that had brought them together. Sandra wore a dress that managed to be both traditional and contemporary, her natural hair styled in an elaborate updo that showcased the diamond earrings Taemin had given her. When she walked down the aisle toward the man who had saved her life in every way that mattered, Sandra felt like she was floating. The ceremony was conducted in both English and Korean, ensuring that Taemin's associates could follow the proceedings while honoring both their cultures. When they exchanged vows, Sandra promised to stand beside him through whatever challenges their unusual life might bring. Taemin vowed to protect and cherish her for as long as he drew breath, to build a world where she could pursue her dreams without fear. The reception was sophisticated but warm, filled with people who understood that they were witnessing something rare, a love story that had emerged from violence and grown into something beautiful. Sandra danced with her new husband surrounded by armed guards who had become friends, celebrated by people who had chosen loyalty and discretion over conventional morality. But the moment that meant the most came late in the evening, when the guests had departed and Sandra found herself alone with Taemin in their new home. Still wearing her wedding dress, still feeling the weight of her new wedding ring, she stood in the kitchen where she would make breakfast for the man who had become her husband. "Mrs. Kong," Taemin said, testing the sound of her new name. "Sandra Williams Kong," she replied, liking the way it sounded. It felt right, complete, like she had finally found the identity she was meant to claim. Taemin moved to stand behind her, his arms encircling her waist as they looked out through the kitchen windows at the mountains that surrounded their sanctuary. In the distance, Sandra could see the lights of the security outposts that monitored their perimeter, the subtle but constant protection that allowed them to live without fear. "What happens now?" Sandra asked, leaning back against his chest. "Now we build the life we want," Taemin replied, his voice soft with contentment. "You finish your nursing certification and open the clinic we discussed. I continue managing my business interests, both legitimate and otherwise. We create something good from everything we've survived." The clinic had been Sandra's idea, a medical facility that provided care to people who couldn't access traditional health care. Trauma survivors, undocumented immigrants, people whose circumstances made them invisible to conventional systems. It would be funded by Taemin's various enterprises, staffed by medical professionals who understood discretion, and located in a facility that offered both treatment and protection. It was their way of transforming the violence that had brought them together into something healing. Every life Sandra saved would be a victory over the forces that had tried to destroy them both. Every person who found safety in their clinic would be proof that love could create light even in the darkest circumstances. "Do you ever regret it?" Sandra asked quietly. "Choosing me instead of someone from your world, someone who already understood the dangers?" Taemin turned her in his arms, cupping her face gently. The question seemed to amuse him, as if he couldn't imagine any other choice. "You are my world now," he said simply. "Everything else is just circumstances we manage together." As they stood in their kitchen, still in their wedding clothes, Sandra reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. 2 years ago, she had been a terrified waitress, counting pennies toward an escape that might not have saved her anyway. Tonight, she was the wife of one of the most powerful men on the West Coast, protected by an empire built on calculated violence and strategic elimination of threats. She should have been horrified by the transformation, should have mourned the ordinary life she might have lived if Marcus had never found her, if Taemin had never noticed her fear. Instead, Sandra felt grateful for every choice that had led her to this kitchen, this man, this life where love was expressed through absolute devotion and safety was maintained through superior firepower. She had found her place in a world where protection was purchased with blood and loyalty was rewarded with security that money alone couldn't buy. Taemin had saved her from Marcus, from human traffickers, from the Chin Syndicate, from every threat that had emerged in their 2 years together. But more than that, he had saved her from a life of fear and struggle and impossible dreams. He had given her education, security, purpose, and a love that would eliminate any threat to their happiness without hesitation. In return, Sandra had given him something he thought he had lost forever: the chance to protect someone successfully, to honor his sister's memory through decisive action, to transform his guilt into something redemptive. They were both broken people who had found healing in each other. Both survivors who had chosen to build something beautiful from the wreckage of their worst experiences. As Tameen carried her to their bedroom, Sandra looked back over the life they had created together. Tomorrow, she would begin her work at the clinic, helping people who needed medical care and protection in equal measure. Tameen would continue managing the complex network of legitimate and illegitimate enterprises that funded their sanctuary. Together, they would face whatever challenges emerged from loving someone in a world where enemies were permanent and threats required absolute elimination. But tonight, in the safety of their mountain fortress, surrounded by loyal guards and bulletproof glass and all the costly security that Tameen's empire could provide, Sandra felt nothing but peace. She had walked into Murphy's diner as a victim fleeing an abuser. She walked out of it as the wife of a dangerous man who would kill anyone who threatened her happiness. The transformation should have terrified her. Instead, as Kong Tameen whispered promises of eternal protection against her lips, Sandra Williams Kong smiled at the beautiful violence of their love.